Hello everyone. In this video, this will be my third part in my series called Hope of the Gentiles, where I will be seeking to address the question of why, given how much the Chinese knew and perceived about God, why then did they not accept the gospel and Jesus? And then furthermore, I will also at the same time be explaining Christianity's history in China. Now, to begin, to summarize in my last video, I made known to you all God's works in ancient China and in the history of ancient China, and the faith that many of the Chinese had, and especially their kings displayed in God. And not only this, but I have also shown that God's power was at work in ancient China, responding to the cries of the oppressed when they were being afflicted by the ancient Chinese dynasties such as the Jia and the Shang, who had become corrupt and had forsaken and ignored God in the latter halves of their reigns. And in the case of the Jia and their final king, Zhe, if that's how you pronounce it, who oppressed the people, God raised up Tang the Conqueror, leader of the Shang, and the founder of the new Shang dynasty, to overthrow the Jia dynasty. And in the same way, when King Solomon had forsaken God in the Bible and his kingdom became corrupt, God raised up adversaries against him, and told King Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 11, and he says, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." And so eventually God would divide Solomon's kingdom, and this would take place during the reign of Solomon's son and successor named Rehoboam. And so like with Solomon's kingdom, the kingdom of China was taken out of the hands of the Jia and given to Tang the Conqueror and the Shang dynasty, who God raised up as adversaries against the Jia. And the same thing happened when the Shang had also descended into corruption later on. And once again, the people cried out to God, whom they called heaven, against the oppressive regime of King Zhao of the Shang, as testified in the ancient Chinese book called the Shu Jing, where it says, "The innocent people call out to heaven, and these terrible deeds are observed." And so just as God observed the terrible deeds of the Shang, God would also observe the terrible deeds of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, even saying that a great outcry had reached him against it. For this is what he says in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 20 through 21. "Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down to see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." And so with that, God, seeing the terrible things being done, poured out his judgment on the Shang. Although he did not completely obliterate them as he had done with Sodom and Gomorrah, because unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, who God could not even find a single decent person left residing in them, save for Lot and his family, who obviously God sent the 2 angels to evacuate them. There were, however, still some good people living among the Shang. And so that is why God, instead of completely wiping them out, sent a liberator in the form of King Wu of the Zhao people, who would also be the founder of the new Zhao dynasty that would come after. He sent King Wu to deliver the oppressed from the oppressor. And we know God was with King Wu and that he purposed to overthrow the corrupt Shang dynasty because of the miracle he had performed at the Battle of Mu, M-U-Y-E. Where, knowing that the Shang forces were divided, they began attacking each other before they had even reached their true opponent. And so King Wu received an easy victory over the Shang. And so let all this suffice to show God's hand in the ancient history of China. But with that, it is now time to move on to the main purpose of this video, which is answering the question that I posed at the beginning of why the Chinese didn't accept the gospel, of which there are a few reasons, and then also explaining Christianity's history in China at the same time. Now, to begin, some people argue that the Apostle Thomas, one of the 12 apostles and disciples of Jesus, obviously God, after the Great Commission, Jesus sent all the apostles out into different parts of the world to spread the knowledge of the gospel in Jesus. And Apostle Thomas specifically, he was sent to many of the nations of the East, but more specifically India, according to tradition. I like to call him the Apostle of the East. But anyway, some argue that he had also made a visit to China as well, But if he did, there's little to no evidence of this, and at best, if he did go to China, his message didn't really gain much traction there at the time. However, Christianity's first official documented presence in China takes us back to the early 7th century, when the first Christian missionary, who was a member of the Nestorian Church, otherwise called the Church of the East, he was called Alopan by the Chinese. Now, during this time, China was ruled by the Tang Dynasty, and the current emperor upon Alopan's arrival was Emperor Taizong, who kindly received him and even arranged for the translation of the New Testament into Chinese at the Imperial Library. After which the emperor read the gospel for himself, and he was very pleased with it. And in 638 AD, Emperor Taizong made this proclamation: "Right principles have no invariable name. Holy men have no invariable station. Instructed is established in accordance with the locality, with the object of benefiting the people at large. The greatly virtuous Alopan of the kingdom of Syria has brought his sacred books and images from that distant part, and he has presented them at our chief capital. Having examined the principles of this religion, we find them to be purely excellent and natural. Investigating its originating source, we find it has taken its rise from the establishment of important truths. Its rituals free from perplexing expressions. Its principles will survive when the framework is forgotten. It is beneficial to all creatures. It is advantageous to mankind. Let it be published throughout the empire, and let the proper authority build a Syrian church in the capital, and the Ening May, which shall be governed by 21 priests." And so with this, we see that Christianity, obviously was openly received in China at first, and was actually given freedom to preach the gospel and build a church by the emperor. And from that day forward, for roughly about 200 some years, Christianity was pretty much unhindered until the later emperor, Emperor Wuzong, who was known as a hardcore traditionalist and follower of the local Chinese religion of Taoism, and looked with suspicion on foreign influences and religion in China. And so he basically began persecuting every foreign religion in China, including Christianity, and effectively banned them and had all their assets taken for the state. And then from there, Christianity would not make a comeback in China until the Mongol conquest of China and the establishment of the foreign Mongol-led Huan dynasty, roughly some 400 years later. Now, during this time, Christianity had actually found a good foothold among the Mongols, and some of the Mongolian tribes had even converted to the faith. And even some of Genghis Khan's own descendants were said to be converted. The Mongols were also known for their religious tolerance, and so Christianity operated and could preach the gospel safely under the Huan dynasty. A good comparison to make, the Mongols were to the Christians much like the Persians were to the Israelites in the Bible. While they didn't fully accept and adopt Christianity, many of their tribal chieftains, who were called Khans by the Mongols, are said to have taken Christian wives, and so Christianity gained much influence with the Mongols. And that is to say, Christianity was favorably received among the Mongols. However, upon the fall of the Mongol-led Huan dynasty, the Chinese people, under the leadership of Zhu Huanzhang, took back China and formed the Ming dynasty with Zhu as the first emperor, or Zhu as the first emperor, who was at that time called the Hongwu Emperor. Now, because of Christianity's affiliation with the previous Mongol-led Huan dynasty, the Chinese obviously didn't look kindly on Christians after their fall. So Christians were once again persecuted and banned throughout most of the succeeding Ming dynasty. However, in the latter half of the Ming dynasty, in the early 17th century, some Jesuit missionaries managed to repair relations and trust to an extent with the Chinese, and reestablished a Christian presence in China. Now, it is worth stating that much of their success was for two important reasons. Firstly, they put what the Apostle Paul preached in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23 into practice, which says, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. And so, in the case of the Jesuit missionaries that went to China, they preached the gospel, but they did so while also affirming and accommodating the culture that surrounded them, in order to win the locals over, just as the Apostle Paul in the Bible had said to do. They drew parallels between what the Chinese religion and philosophy of Confucianism called heaven and what the philosophy and religion of Taoism called the Tao, which translates to the way in Chinese, and they compared these to the God of Christianity. And then they also went as far as actually wearing Chinese clothes and to again affirm the culture that surrounded them, to make the gospel appear more attractive. Now, Chinese perceptions of God or the supreme power above in these religions and philosophies, that is Confucianism and Taoism, differed slightly from the more ancient Chinese from back in the Shang and Zhao dynasties, which I talked about in my last video. Nevertheless, parallels still existed between God and the Chinese perception of heaven, and etc. And so now from here, Christianity was tolerated and allowed in China without being completely banned, but it still continued to be rejected at large. And the reason usually always came down to the Chinese being very zealous for tradition and trying to defend their culture and way of life from foreign influence, fearing that it would uproot it, and just being suspicious of anything it deemed foreign in general. Now, I will say, in China's defense, besides losing possession of their country for a good period of time when the Mongols invaded and conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty back in the 13th and 14th centuries, there were some cases, especially later on in the 19th and 20th centuries, where many European nations were trying to establish their own spheres of influence in China, and particularly sought to exploit China economically, sometimes even legally. One good example of this is what is called the Opium Wars. Now, these wars occurred in the mid-19th century. I will specifically be talking about just the first Opium War because there was two of them. If you want to know about both, you can look them up for yourself, but I'll be talking only about the first one. Now, these conflicts mainly occurred because of trade disputes between China and European nations, especially like Britain and France. Now, before the first Opium War, China was willing to export many of its materials and resources to Europe. And leading up to the first Opium War, they traded extensively with Britain especially. But while they exported much to Britain, the only thing China really wanted or imported from Britain was silver. And they not really cared to import anything else. So suffice to say that trade was in China's favor and not Britain's. And so to even the odds, Britain decided to start importing opium into China, eventually leading to a big social problem in China where many people became addicted to the drug and some even died. And so, China, becoming alarmed by this, ended up banning the production and importation of opium in China. But in response, Britain started illegally smuggling opium in through Chinese middlemen. And so the emperor at the time commissioned a government official by the name of Lin Zexu, Zexu, to crack down on the cultivation and distribution of opium. And so he did. Many Chinese dealers were arrested, and thousands of opium stocks were destroyed. Foreign companies and merchants were also forced to give up all their supplies of opium for confiscation and destruction. And so, these actions upset the British, who considered it offensive and uncivilized that the Chinese did not want to tolerate their illegal activities and their meddling in China's territory, causing a crisis in the nation. They considered it a violation of their free trade laws, which they assumed applied to everyone because they said so. And so began the First Opium War, where Britain sent a number of British warships and merchantmen, and long story short, they had a decisive victory. And in the aftermath, the Chinese were forced to sign the treaty called the Treaty of Nanjing, which gave no benefits pretty much to the Chinese, but all kinds of benefits to the British. The treaty basically forced the Chinese to pay indemnities to the British government and foreign merchants, even though it was they who were the lawbreakers. And the treaty also forced the Chinese to open up more ports for trade. And any British citizens who resided at these ports could not be judged by Chinese laws, but only British ones. And so this is just one example of many of Britain and other European countries meddling in China. And China would be forced to sign many other unfair treaties later, giving advantages to the Europeans as they would spread what you might call imperialism throughout the land. Actions and events like this, and the many more that occurred both before and after it, would prove to be a snare for Christianity and a stumbling block to Chinese hearing the message of the gospel and Jesus. And so eventually a time would come when the Chinese would be completely fed up with it all. Because to them, the Europeans were basically invaders trying to impose their demands on China to get what they wanted. And in their eyes, the Christians would have been seen by many as nothing more than agents of European imperialism and hypocrites because of their affiliation with those whom didn't even live by the very principles Christianity preach and the beliefs they affirm. I mean, the Bible clearly condemns such actions. I don't think I need to explain or enlighten to anyone that greed is obviously condemned in the Bible, and the commandments of thou shalt not covet were also broken. More than that, the Europeans derided Chinese authority and broke China's laws. And in their arrogance, when their drug peddling was exposed and their opium was taken from them, they actually thought that they deserved to be compensated for knowingly breaking the law. I mean, if anyone wants to be contentious about this, then let them, but quite frankly, the condemnation is deserved for the British in this case. Now, the Apostle Peter tells us how the believer should properly conduct themselves in front of others, and especially in front of unbelievers. And so this is what he says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 through 17. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. And so with that, the believer ought to make every effort to win people's trust and respect. Not just through words, but through actions. Now, I'm not saying you must be perfect, but you must put forth an effort. And this is especially true for missionaries or those of us who visit foreign nations. We are obligated, like the verse I just read off to you, we are obligated to submit to whatever laws and authority that exists in whatever nation you reside in or visit. And as much as those said laws and authority do not cause you or force you to sin, that is. If we strive to conduct ourselves in righteousness, people and authorities will take notice of it. And so the message of Jesus and the gospel will appear more attractive to those who listen to it. However, if we act as the British and many other European nations acted, will China and even the world not look upon us as hypocritical lawbreakers? If so, it will reflect back at the church, and worse, it will reflect back at Jesus, and it will reflect back at the gospel. And so when such actions are carried out, the church must condemn it, lest the church wishes to share in the guilt and condemnation of the perpetrator. As is written in the book of Romans, chapter 2, verses 23 to 24. You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That last part of the verse, you might read that as God is blasphemed among the unbelievers because of you, because that's kind of what the verse is trying to say. Now, if we are blaspheming God by breaking the law or living sinfully among the unbelievers and causing others harm or trouble, who then would open their doors for us? Who then would care to listen to us or anything we have to say or preach for that matter? Therefore, I say this, avoid the latter and strive to conduct yourselves fittingly so that Jesus and the gospel isn't brought to disrepute. The church, inasmuch as it is within their power, must also be careful who they affiliate themselves with. For the true believer lives in this world, but he is not of it. Now, one more major event that would negatively affect Christianity's reputation in China was the event known as the Taiping Rebellion. Now, this one's a little more complicated, so bear with me. The Taiping Rebellion was basically a civil war between the Qing Dynasty, or the Qing Dynasty, Qing, and a kingdom that called itself the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace that took place around the mid-19th century. Now, this heavenly kingdom was led by a man named I'm going to try to pronounce this, Zhuquan, who was a deceiver, and let me explain why. This man, he claimed to have had visions of going to heaven and seeing two figures who he identified as God the Father, or Shangdi as he called them, and which, obviously was the old Chinese name for God, and another figure he identified as Jesus. Now, at first, he had no idea what to make of these figures that he saw or who they were. But later, after coming into contact with two Protestant missionaries named Edwin Stevens and Liang Fa, who was, I believe, a recent convert, from whom he received a pamphlet called Good Words for Exhorting the Age, which was written by Liang Fa himself. Upon reading this work, Han began making his own interpretations in association with the visions he had and the pamphlet he received from these two missionaries. And he ended up somehow coming to the conclusion that God was not only, like his spiritual father, if you will, but also his literal father. But that Jesus was also his literal elder brother. I know, it's confusing. And that he himself had been ordered by them to rid the land of demon worship. And so after this, Hong Zhuquan began using his own interpretations of God and Christianity, and eventually he and his cousin and assistant named Fang Yunshan started their own cult called the God Worshipping Society. And Hong quickly started gaining many converts and started ordering the destruction of many Confucian and Buddhist sacred objects, among other things associated with them. And he also began translating his own version of the Bible. Eventually, Chinese authorities were alarmed by the cult's growth and ordered its dispersion. Hong refused, and the government sent forces to destroy them, to which Hong and his followers initially managed to defeat them, marking the beginning of the Taiping Rebellion and the founding of Hong Zhuquan's Heavenly Kingdom. Now, from here, the Heavenly Kingdom had a few more victories, but they were eventually wiped out. But during the conflict, they basically killed anyone who refused to join them. And no one should be surprised by events like this, and because Jesus and the apostles in the Bible warned us that there would come deceivers and false teachers who would lead many people astray. For example, this is what the book of 2 Peter, chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, says concerning these false teachers. And it says, "Many will follow their shameful ways and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. In their greed, these teachers will exploit you with stories they have made up. Their condemnation has long been hanging over them, and their destruction has not been sleeping." And so, in the case of the Taiping Rebellion and Hong Zhuquan, he was basically one of these false teachers. And because of his association with Christianity, even though his actions clearly prove that he was no true believer at all, the things he and his cult did would rub off on Christianity's image in China. And so now, by the early 20th century, the Chinese monarchy had been overthrown, and many cultural and political movements arose that looked upon the West with scorn as an imperial threat to their nation. Eventually, communism would begin taking root in China and would eventually seize power in the country not long after World War II in 1949. And with that, Christianity's position has been pretty much the same since that time up to the present day, where it has been pretty much completely banned and Christians have been having to meet in secret that are in China. And now also another important reason for Christianity's failure, if you will, not just in China, but arguably throughout many of the nations of the East in general, like that is east of Europe, A lot of that was because of Buddhism and also Islam, who were basically the dominant religions of many of the nations in the East. And so Christianity often found itself competing against these major religions who had already firmly established themselves in the East. Buddhism especially was very prominent in China when Christians actually first arrived there. And so now, in conclusion, I think it is suffice to say that Christianity's history in China is one of ups and downs, but mostly downs. It started off decently, but later drew suspicion for much of the Chinese leadership for the reasons covered earlier. And I will say that much of Europe's actions, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, certainly did not help in that regard. It doesn't look good on Jesus and the gospel when nations that at that time were considered Christian nations, behave and act in the way that they did. Now, I only use the British as an example with like the first Opium War, but many others had also done similar things. When a student acts badly, it reflects back on the teacher. When a child acts back badly, it reflects back on the parent. And so ultimately, the teacher and the parent become looked down upon as a result. So when Christians don't at least try to behave like a Christian ought to, that the Bible and Jesus calls us to, it makes Jesus look bad. It does. And so it is no surprise then that the Bible on numerous occasions also condemns hypocrisy. And so I'll just say this, strive to avoid it. But now, with all that being said, I hope you all enjoyed this video. And in the next one, I will be moving on to the Native Americans and their relationship with God and their perceptions about Him. And with that, God bless you all, and I will see you all in the next one.